Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our study of God's Shepherd King in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Still looking at the story of David. Last week, I'll say we, as in we, Pastor Dan and I, we apologize for not having class, and for those who are online and expecting that we were going to have class last week. We really blame it on Pastor Adam. Just lovingly, because when he left and took a call to Kansas, we redid the schedule because he was on the schedule for some of the Tuesdays, and at the same time, we were putting together the Lenten midweek schedule, and we decided, we really shouldn't teach Bible class and preach Tuesday worship on the same week. Because, I would be teaching here and then have to just jet upstairs and get ready, and it's just a lot. So since there are two of us, we just split that up, and whoever's preaching that day is not doing Bible class, and I changed the schedule on Pastor Dan. And he had the old schedule, and I had the new schedule. And so I assumed he was doing Bible class because I was preaching last week, and he assumed I was teaching because my name was on the schedule. And so it's really Dan's fault. Just blame everything on Dan. No, that's what happened. And so everything was fine. No one was sick or injured or no emergency. Just Pastor Dan was getting his hair cut at the time. All of them cut, but you know what I mean. Yeah. We're in 2 Samuel 18 and 19 today. So what we're doing is actually, I changed up the schedule a little bit. So basically covering what we would have done last week and this week together, and that's okay. So instead of 40 sessions, which seems like a really round number, which it should have been, it's going to be 39 sessions. Seems a little off, but, that's what it'll end up being by the end of this. So we're in session 30. Let's pray first, then a little background, context, all that. Okay, let's pray first. Our gracious Lord, good morning. Thank you for bringing us here today, and thank you for your opportunity that you give to us to be in your word and to be fed by your Spirit, even when the stories seem so ancient and disconnected. We pray that you would help us to understand what you would have us learn today, the lesson that is applicable, the principles at play here that never change. Your timeless truth is your timeless truth. And so we pray that you would just, by your Spirit, lead us to that truth, that we would take it and apply it to our lives in a way that will bring honor to you, and that will strengthen us and one another in faith. We love you, Jesus. Amen. All right. You can see at the top, I give this regularly just to see the broad overview of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the story arc that goes through the entire 2 books. If you heard last week, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, I get ahead on doing videos for the 66 and 26, and so I can't remember even what day we're on, honestly. But I think last week when we started 1 Samuel in our 66 and 26 journey, I mentioned that all 4 books of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings were all one book at one point. There's all one written together as a story arc of David and the rise of the kingship, and then Solomon and the other kings, and then the fall of Israel, the fall of Judah. That was known as the Book of Kings, or the Book of Reigns, right? R-E-I-G-N-S, reigns, the kingships, or the years of reign of each a king and that sort of thing. So anyway, all one book, but we're only doing the first 2, or the first half of that Book of Reigns, because we already did 1 and 2 Samuel a little while back when I decided to dive into that a couple years ago. We're not doing that anymore. We're almost done with 2 Samuel. You can see with only one more box. After this one that we're on now, David's failure and his consequences. That's where we're at. In these chapters, this moment that we're in the history of Israel is following after Absalom's rebellion. Absalom is David's son who decided to usurp his father's authority and gathered and really kind of led a revolt against his own father and rallied most of the troops of Israel's army, most of the tribes of Israel around him against David, surprisingly. Because David, you look back on the history of Israel, and David is seen as like the king. Like this was the golden age of Israel, and yet you have this moment of almost everyone in Israel coming up against David. And it is a fulfillment of the prophecy that Nathan shared with David after his what's a word for it? Disgusting, disturbing sin with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah and all that. And Nathan came to David, and he said, "The sword will never depart from your house." 2 Samuel 12, if you remember that. The sword will never depart from your house. And this is a fulfillment of that. It's actually, there are consequences that happen in an earthly sense. That all of our eternal consequences are laid on Christ, and so we are forgiven. We don't have to experience the eternal consequences for our sin, but there's still temporal, earthly, temporary consequences that we have to live with from our sin, and that is definitely going on with David. And really, all of Israel suffers because of David's sin. It's sort of like this ripple that goes throughout the entire nation of Israel. Well, that doesn't seem fair, but this is the consequence of sin. It moves out from the center and affects a lot of other people, and even including the innocent who had nothing to do with it. So we see that playing out in 2 Samuel 18 and 19. All right, so backing up a little bit, chapter 16, 17, remember that as a part of that rebellion and Absalom rallying the troops of Israel, David decided that he could spare the people of Jerusalem and those loyal to him from further suffering by just leaving the capital city, Jerusalem, and going down to Jericho and across the Jordan River. And then as Absalom came with a superior army, he would not have to besiege the city, destroy the city, kill people along the way. He could just walk in, and David just allowed that to happen. So David quietly left. That's what we saw last time. In the meantime, the battle does go on, and we're going to start reading in 2 Samuel 18. As we do, we just read the whole thing and see what God has for us after that. So I'm going to read through verse 18. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent the troops out, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, "I myself will surely march out with you." But the men said, "You must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city." The king answered, "I will do whatever seems best to you." So the king stood beside the gate while all the men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. This is kind of an important detail right here, right? The king says, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." Everyone heard it. Verse 6, the army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There the army of Israel was defeated by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept on going. When one of the men saw this, he told Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." Joab said to the man who had told him, "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I had put my life in jeopardy, and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab said, "I'm not going to wait like this for you." So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name." He named the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Kind of interesting story here. How did Absalom get caught in the tree so long that he gave time for this man to come to Joab and tell him that, and then Joab come out and throw javelins through his heart? He must have really been tangled up. Well, he was tangled up by his hair, apparently. And it's interesting because this is on your handout under point B. The second last bullet, Absalom's hair was a symbol of his pride and identity. If you were to go back a few chapters to chapter 14, you would see this. Absalom was considered, in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair from time to time when it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. 5 pounds of hair. So thick, like, tall, dark, and handsome kind of a guy. That's what this Absalom was. And so his hair was a source of pride, and it was his downfall. Because he got so tangled up in the oak tree that he couldn't even release himself with his hair, and gave enough time for the soldiers to catch up to him and run him through. And then cut him down from a tree and heap rocks upon him in a pit in the forest. And so pride comes before the fall, as they say, right? What kind of questions do you have about this whole episode here?
If he's got the full weight of his body while he's hanging there in the oak tree,
Yeah.
he's got a lot of stress on his.
Yeah, a lot of stress on his neck. Yeah, there's a lot of stress on his head, and yeah.
I would think that would be the same thing as hanging.
Yeah, it would feel like, I would imagine it would be not too much different than hanging, except you don't have that ligature around your neck that would cause even more stress. But yeah, absolutely, that would not have been comfortable, I don't think, for sure.
Wasn't Absalom supposedly a good guy? People looked up to him.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people were attracted to Absalom. He seemed like a man of honor, but then he led this revolt, this rebellion against the king. It's interesting because we've mentioned this before in 1st and 2nd Samuel. There seems to be a lot of contrasts. There are a lot of pieces of the story that are told in order to draw out the contrasts. Where David, when he was anointed to be king, and Saul was already king, David went years without self-promotion, without inserting himself into the affairs of the king, and twice at least he had opportunity to take out Saul, who was chasing him, trying to kill him, and David had every opportunity to raise his sword against Saul and take him out. And he refused to, and he said, "Far be it from me to raise my hand against the Lord's anointed." And that was David's attitude. And in contrast to that is Absalom, who cannot wait to be king and fights to have his father's throne. Yeah.
What's with this family?
What's with what family?
Well, Saul and David didn't get along and threatened to try to kill each other, and now Absalom.
Well, yeah, I mean, what the heck is right? I was thinking about this too as preparing for Bible study today. This kind of fighting has been going on forever in the Middle East. It's still going on in the Middle East. Still, to this day. It's just
Dysfunctional family.
it's just a dysfunctional. Jacob's family is dysfunctional. Yeah, we've talked about this kind of concept before too, where you look to something like, oh, if we just had that king like all the other nations, then we will be something. And then God gives them a king, and they realize, this is not the answer. And God, it's almost like God has to allow them what they think they need and want so that they get it. No, this is not really what we want. This is not good. And so rather than putting their trust in the king, they should turn to put their trust in the Lord. Now, does that always happen? No. But that's the lesson we should take from it, and they should have taken from it at the time, that they don't trust in the king. And then here comes David, and you're like, yes, finally, man after God's own heart. God even says this about David, a man after his own heart. And oh boy, the golden age of Israel, we have arrived. And then this whole Bathsheba thing and all the consequences that come after it. And 20,000 men died. The troops of Israel, 20,000 of them as a consequence of David's sin. Unbelievable. And so all of Israel, if 20,000 people died in battle, there's not a household that is not affected in the whole land of Israel. And everyone is grieving. And they're realizing, okay, this isn't the answer. I mean, at least they should. They turn and go, oh man, money. We got money in the retirement account. And then 2008 hits, and it's like, poof, the market goes down. And you go, okay, it's rebounding. And then all of a sudden, it's poof, tank. And then you're like, okay, God, maybe I should take a lesson from this. I don't put my trust in my retirement account. I put my trust in you. And that should be the lesson that we take from it. And, so over and over, this kind of thing happens where God allows us a certain amount of success and devastation as a way of testing where our trust really is. And we've said this before. Why would God give us a president such as Biden or Trump? I mean, I don't know what side you're on. Quite frankly, I'm not a politician. God is not a Republican. God is not a Democrat. And you look at either one and you go, what are you thinking? God, what are you doing? Well, is my trust going to be in the president or in God? May it be said of us that our hope and our confidence and our trust are in God, not our president. Well, we're going to be able to, if we just get the right judges elected. That sounds really dangerous too, doesn't it? Get it? So just over and over again. This is, Saul wasn't the answer. David's not the answer. Absalom's not the answer. Solomon will not be the answer after Absalom. Then after Solomon, the whole thing goes to hell in a handbasket because the kingdom divides, and you get all of a sudden Rehoboam and Jeroboam and Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And already here we're going to see this, is that there's the seeds of that disunity among the tribes already here in chapter 19. We're going to see that here in a bit. All right.
So many people have died in this war.
Mm-hmm.
People have died in the war now.
In the war now, as in 2 Samuel or in 2026?
2026.
Oh, how many people have died? Yeah, I mean, in that war, there were a lot of people who died. How many have died? Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. That's, there's always this warfare going on in the Middle East that is not new. There's been fighting going on there for literally thousands of years. Yeah. The whole couple of years ago when it was Israel and Gaza, that Gaza Strip is exactly the area where the Philistines were. And we're talking about 1,000 years before Jesus. 1,000 years before Jesus, the Philistines and the Israelites were battling it out over and over and over. During this period right here in 2 Samuel. It's still going on today. 3,000 years later. All right, we should move on so I can read all of these 2 chapters for us. All right, now we're in 2 Samuel 18:19. Now, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies." This is the good news, right? "You are not the one to take the news today," Joab told him. "You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to a Cushite, Go tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he is alone, he must have good news." And the man came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." How'd you like to be known for your run? Oh, that I could see. I recognize that one running. That's my Ahimaaz. "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Of all the things that David cares about, whether there's victory or not, is my son safe? Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was." The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, "The king is grieving for his son." The men stole into the city that day, as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. They had won, but they came in feeling ashamed instead, almost like they were defeated. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, "Today you have humiliated all your men. You have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now." So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. And what does that mean, that the king came out to the gateway? Well, he came out, he was actually following Joab's urging to go out and encourage the men and say, "No, I do love and care about you, and thank you for leading us in this victory, even though he was grieving. So there's this balance that's going on, right? David is obviously grieving for his son, but he also needs to show leadership to the troops who were with him. So there's kind of this interesting thing going on here. Why are there two messengers sent? Joab says, first Ahaz, no, you're not going to go send this Cushite. And by the way, one of them is named. The other one has no name at all. He's just a Cushite. What is a Cushite? It's actually someone from Ethiopia. Cush was in Africa, like Ethiopia area. And so he's a foreigner. He's not a natural Israelite. Why send him? Why this unnamed dude?
Because if he didn't take the news well, he'd kill the guy.
Yeah. If he didn't take the news well, he could kill the messenger. Yeah. And you don't send one of your best troops. You don't send the guy you know by name. The guy that the watchman knows how he runs, right? You're not sending that guy. You're sending some unnamed. This is like if you remember the old Star Trek, the TV series. It was always that unnamed red shirt guy that goes on the away team and gets killed, right? It's kind of the extra. That's the Cushite. That's kind of the idea. Because David could take the news poorly, and he had before. If you remember, there's I can't remember the guy's name. Decided, I'm going to go tell David that I killed Saul. And what does David do? He has him killed. Yeah. Saul was even David's enemy. He kept trying to kill him, but still he was the Lord's anointed. And David said, again, far be it from me to harm the Lord's anointed. And he killed the guy who killed Saul. So that can't happen. Joab knows this. But Ahimaaz decides to go anyway and outruns, takes a little bit different route and gets there first and tells the news. I find it interesting that pretty sure Ahimaaz knows exactly what happened to Absalom. It's not that he was absent and, there's all this confusion going on. I really don't know what happened. I'm not sure. But I know that God has delivered you from the hands of your enemy. And that I know. That's the good news. He is not willing to share the bad news. But this Cushite, I think, has little idea who Absalom is in relation to David. And he says, may all the enemies of the king be like that young man. David knew what that meant, clearly. But the Cushite was not harmed. David just went up into the tower and wept bitterly, covered his face, and cried, O Absalom, my son, my son. Anybody find it interesting that it was Joab who killed Absalom? Why is that interesting? Joab wanted to protect his king. That is true. Why is it interesting that it's Joab in particular? I don't think he wanted credit for it so much. I think, in fact, I don't think that Joab ever wanted David to know that it was him who ran the javelins through Absalom's heart. Joab is the one who took care of Uriah for David. Joab was the general who was in charge of the forward part of the Israelite army when they were attacking and David sent news or a command to Joab that he should put Uriah at the front line and then retreat and leave Uriah to die. So Joab is the one dude who knows what King David did with Uriah. He's the one guy who knows that part of the story. And it is Joab who took out David's son. Now, I don't know, we don't know, the Bible doesn't tell it. It's almost this gap in the story that it's left to figure out. Did Joab do that on purpose? Not because Absalom was David's enemy, but because of what David had asked him to do before, and very intentionally took out David's son. I don't know. We don't know that, but I suspect that if he is, he's a human being. If I were given that order and I followed that order, not quite sure I'd know how to feel about that one. So, just a thought. Anything else from this portion of the story that jumps out to you that you have questions about as we were reading through that? Why did Absalom turn against his dad? I think, I don't know. I think part of it is like young ambition. I think that it was very much, I want to be king. And I don't know, if someone remembers, I'm not remembering any particular part of the way that 2 Samuel is told in the past chapters, if it really spells that out, other than this is, it's almost like, it's almost like this is the spirit that is prominent in David's family because of that sin and the consequence that comes from, Nathan saying the sword is never going to leave your house, and it's almost like Absalom was destined for rebellion against David as a way of bringing conflict. Whether that's God ordained or just, it's like he's conceived in that kind of, Absalom was conceived in that spirit of rebellion and selfishness. And he lived it. He was a manifestation of that selfishness. That was a product of David's selfishness.
That phrase, the sword will never leave your house, I misunderstood that. I thought at first that meant that you'd always remain king and powerful in your...
Oh, yeah, you misunderstood when it says the sword will never leave for your house. Yeah, that doesn't mean, that's not the scepter, like he will always be king. Although it's interesting that God never removes that promise from David that your house, your lineage will never stop having a king in Israel. But always conflict too. Yeah, so there's going to be a sword. It's not just like he's always going to be king, but no, the sword of that division and violence will always be a part of his legacy. Yeah. So it's interesting that you see the consequence, but you also see God's grace, right? Because God doesn't remove the promise that that David's line is going to be royal lineage for generations, and it's through David that the Messiah comes. It's through that family line that Jesus comes, who is the king the ultimate and only true king, which is a fulfillment of God's promise and his grace, even while there have to be consequences. Yeah. Marge? That Absalom may have been jealous because of David and Bathsheba's love for Solomon. Yeah, I don't know if I'd have to review the story. I mean, this is not something that I was really even thinking about. So Absalom. I have to dig into that a little bit more. Yeah. Looking back a little bit. I have to do a little research on that, Marge. Like what was the root of Absalom's? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, then there's all kinds of dysfunction going on, because if you remember back to chapter 13, then one of David's sons was in love with another son, which is Absalom's sister, and just all kinds of. I have to look back on that. Good question. Anything else there? All right, I have about 10 minutes or so, and we'll cover the last section here, David's return to Jerusalem, in the last couple pages here from 2 Samuel 19. So we'll start at the middle of verse 8, 2 Samuel 19, verse 8. In the middle, David returns to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, so David had sat down at the gateway to spend time encouraging his troops. But meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes, and throughout the tribes of Israel, the people were all arguing with each other, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country because of Absalom, and Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. "Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my brothers, my own flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa," Amasa, by the way, is the man that Absalom put in charge of the Israelite army in place of Joab. When Absalom rallied the troops in rebellion, Joab was with David. Amasa was with Absalom. And David is saying, "Say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if from now on you are not the commander of my army in place of Joab." He's actually taken one of the guy who led the rebellion under Absalom and making him the chief officer for his army. Isn't that interesting? He went over the hearts of all the men of Judah as though they were one man. So the Judahites, at least, the tribe of Judah, really loved David. All the men of Judah, as though they were one man, he won their hearts. They sent word to the king, "Return, you and all your men." Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. Shimei was the guy who was on the road going out of Jerusalem. If you remember from last time, Shimei was the guy who's on the road. He's a relative of King Saul. And Shimei was hurling insults and curses upon, like all the way from Jerusalem to the Jordan. Like he's just following the train and throwing stones and throwing insults and curses at David this whole time. And well, now he comes as David is coming back as king. And I think he's thinking, uh-oh. I cursed the king and now he's the one victorious. And now what do I do? So he hurried down to meet with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites. Now, I want you to notice this. It was the men of Judah, and with him were 1,000 Benjamites. Benjamin was a small tribe right next to Judah. Later on, as you get down the story after King Solomon, David's son was Solomon. Solomon was king. He built the temple. After Solomon, there was a split. 10 tribes went with the north, called Israel, and 2 tribes stayed with the south. That was Judah. And who was with Judah? The Benjamites. Those 2 tribes joined together as Judah, and all the rest known as Israel. So here's, sort of the seeds of division, the seeds of division that'll grow into much more later. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned, but today I have come here as the first of the whole household of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king." Then Abishai, same guy who said, shouldn't we just stone this guy to death on the way out of Jerusalem, Abishai again, son of Zeruiah, said, shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. David replied, "What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? This day you have become my adversaries. Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Do I not know that today I am king over Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king promised him on oath. Now, I'm just going to pause here for just a second. Just say, there are a lot of places in the Old Testament. If you've been going through the 66 and 26 and you watch my videos that I'm doing on the explanation each day, one of the things that we see over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament is that there are little glimpses, hints along the way that are pointing forward to Jesus. And you get little glimpses of, as an example, grace. Where here's this one, David, who has been heaped with insults. What does David do? You shall not die for your insults. And he shows grace and compassion. Fast forward 1,000 years to Jesus on the cross as people are hurling insults at him. And what does he say? "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." It's like this little preview, a foreshadowing. If you study literature, you know the idea of foreshadowing. There's a little hint, there's a little glimpse of something that is, okay, there's something going on here. And then all of a sudden you get to that story that is the real thing happening, which is in Jesus, and you go, oh yeah, back there, that was this compassion and grace shown from David. David is like Jesus. David is not like Jesus in a lot of ways, but there were certain ways that David was like Jesus. And there are other things like that all over the New Testament, or all over the Old Testament, that give us glimpses and hints. Verse 24. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" And he said, "My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant, my lord the king, to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever pleases you. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king. But you gave your servant," this, when you're saying your servant, he's always meaning himself, right? This is kind of the way people talked. But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? And the king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the fields," which means Mephibosheth is getting a share of the portion of the land. He's getting fields divided among those who are dividing the plunder of war. The result of the 20,000 people dying, I think. And so divide the fields. And Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything now that my lord the king has arrived home safely." He's like, okay. I think he's being a little too, almost like overly, what's the word? When you're trying to win someone over and you're being flattering, he's over flattering, and it's almost like, oh no, I really don't need the fields, let him have it all, because he's really trying to make sure that he is not going to be held accountable for not really going with David along the way. David had blessed him with being at his table, even though he was a descendant of Saul, and still he didn't go with. And so anyway, there's this whole thing. Oh man, we had to end here. I'll finish reading this and we'll end. The king, let's see, verse 31. Barzillai, the Gileadite, Gilead is on the other side of the Jordan, so where David had landed with his family and his household servants and his troops were on the opposite side of the Jordan from Jerusalem. And that's where Gilead is. So Barzillai, the Gileadite, also came down from Regalim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now, Barzillai was a very old man, 80 years old. He had provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." But Barzillai answered the king, how many more years will I live that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I'm now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is good and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of men and women singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance, but why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my father and mother. But here's my servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do for him whatever pleases you." The king said, "Kingham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever pleases you, and anything you deserve from me, I will do for you." So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and gave him his blessing, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops in Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan together with all these men?" All the men of Judah answered the king of Israel, "We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves? Then the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king, and besides, we have a greater claim on David than you have. So why do you treat us with contempt? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the men of Judah responded even more harshly than the men of Israel. See this division between Judah and Israel all of a sudden? Now, King David is trying to bless Barzillai. Come with me to Jerusalem. He's too old. He actually sends one of his servants instead. There's actually a place in Jeremiah that speaks of like a retreat or a oasis kind of a center in Israel near Bethlehem that had the name of Kimham. So there must have been like later generations, this man who came from across the Jordan with David back to Jerusalem was blessed and given a parcel of land, and his family continued on even through, again, hundreds of years after to Jeremiah. And kind of an interesting little story there. I got to let you go so you can get upstairs. It is now 10:56. You got 4 minutes to worship. All right.